Hello, and welcome to the premiere episode of True Believer, a show about what we believe and why we believe it. I'm your host, Diablo Neruda, and today I'll be talking about the recent assassination of Charlie Kirk, the reaction from across the political spectrum, and compare it to another terrorist attack on free speech from 10 years ago, the Al-Qaeda attack on the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. If you enjoy this content, please leave a comment and a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. I plan on producing more essays like this one in the future. You can also find my work in written form at Substack/@TrueBeliever, or follow me on X at Diablo Neruda, all one word. Now let's get to it. The attack on Charlie Hebdo. 10 years ago, amidst the second decade of the War on Terror and the United States occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, two French-born Algerian Muslim brothers marched into the second-floor Paris office of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, armed with AK-47 style assault rifles, pistols, and explosives, shouting Allahu Akbar. Claiming they were there to avenge the Prophet Muhammad, they opened fire on the magazine's staff, killing 12 and injuring 11 others. The pair fled the scene on foot following the attack, hijacking a car and engaging in a gunfight with the police, during which they shot one officer in the head. The getaway vehicle was found abandoned 3 kilometers north of the Charlie Hebdo office, containing Molotov cocktails and jihadist flags. Following the attack, Paris was on high alert, and a massive manhunt began for the two men. The police set up roadblocks across the city while helicopters circled the sky in search of the killers. Simultaneously, spontaneous vigils appeared across France, where crowds chanted the slogan Je suis Charlie, or I am Charlie, in an expression of solidarity with the magazine's staff and in support of free speech. The French president, François Hollande, visited the scene of the attack and declared the following day a national day of mourning. The next morning, the two brothers were spotted in the woods outside a nearby town, where they stole food from a gas station before hijacking another car. A day later, they arrived at a printing company about 35 kilometers outside of Paris, where they barricaded themselves inside after taking a hostage. It was there that they staged their final standoff with elite police tactical forces, shouting declarations of their allegiance to Al-Qaeda during the firefight before they were both ultimately killed in the shootout. The hostage was freed unharmed. In the days that followed, marches across France drew crowds of approximately 4 million, with nearly 1.5 million gathering in Paris alone, in a show of unity in support of free speech and condemnation of the terrorists. World leaders joined in the Paris marches, and the slogan Je suis Charlie became a viral meme shared on social media by millions around the world. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was quick to claim responsibility for the attack, citing depictions of the Prophet Muhammad the magazine had published. Charlie Hebdo had previously been firebombed in 2011, and the magazine's servers were hacked, displaying an extremist message when visitors attempted to access their homepage. Outside of radical terror organizations, the Islamic world broadly and unequivocally condemned the attacks and voiced solidarity with the people of France. On the day of the killing, the Saudi foreign minister issued a statement declaring the attack a cowardly terrorist act which is incompatible with Islam and its tolerant teachings. The Saudi ambassador later joined in the march in Paris. Iran's foreign ministry condemned the attack as well, declaring any terrorist action against innocent people is unjustifiable. The Qatari foreign ministry condemned the attack as a violation of human and moral values. Grand Imam al-Azhar Ahmed al-Taib called the attack a sinful act and urged Muslims to reject violence, stating Islam prohibits killing innocent people. Al-Azhar later issued a fatwa reinforcing that terrorism contradicts Islamic teachings. The Council of Senior Scholars in Saudi Arabia called it a crime against humanity and stressed that Islam forbids targeting civilians. Even Hezbollah leader Nasran Nasrallah declared Takfiri terrorist groups, referring to Sunni extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, had insulted Islam more than even those who've attacked the Prophet. Hamas stated that difference of opinion and thought cannot justify murder, while the Palestinian Liberation Organization echoed Hamas and condemned the violence outright. My Muslim friends around the world, mostly in the United States, Canada, and Saudi Arabia, were just as swift to denounce the attacks on Charlie Hebdo. Although few proclaimed Je suis Charlie on social media, they didn't celebrate, downplay, or equivocate about the deaths of the Charlie Hebdo staffers either. What I recall from my conversations was a universal sense of shame and discomfort. They felt these terrorist acts were a stain on their faith. I distinctly recall one friend telling me, "They're not us, we hate them too." Another explained that although it was haram to make depictions of the Prophet, this applied to Muslims, not those outside the faith. This restriction was meant to prevent idolatry, as images of the prophet might encourage his worship, and the murder of innocents was far greater sin than making cartoons of Muhammad. This is not to say that there were no condemnation of the cartoons that Charlie Hebdo had published. Charlie Hebdo was in the business of pushing people's buttons, and they gave no quarter to Jews or the Catholic Church either. Many of their cartoons were plainly racist, and some in the West felt uncomfortable declaring Je suis Charlie because of it. In Pakistan and in some parts of the Middle East, there were protests against the magazine, but they were small and vastly overshadowed by the condemnations of the attack itself. Except in the rarest of fringe cases, there was no celebration in the Islamic world. No deflection or equivocation, no mealy-mouthed words denouncing violence followed by unabashed rationalizations and vilification of the victims. No attempts to depict the terrorists as anything other than Muslim extremists. The brutal murders at the Charlie Hebdo office were nearly universally denounced as savage and immoral. Ironically, the attacks on Charlie Hebdo became the rationale for the French government to crack down on free speech later that year. A comedian was arrested for hate speech, while dozens of others were jailed for insulting religious faith, or in some cases speaking in favor of the men who had carried out the attacks on Charlie Hebdo. Supporters of Palestine were also convicted after encouraging the boycott of Israeli products while protesting a supermarket. These free speech violations by the state went mostly unnoticed by the press and social media. But in the wake of the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, nearly everyone had declared not only their support for Charlie Hebdo, but that they were Charlie. Now, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. 3 weeks ago, on September 10th in Orem, Utah, the conservative political activist and founder of Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk, was speaking at an event at Utah Valley University, where he took questions from a crowd of approximately 3,000 students, professors, and members of the community. While being asked about trans individuals involved in mass shootings, Kirk was fatally shot in the neck. The details of what happened and how the shooter pulled the assassination off without notice are still murky. The official narrative, based on a police charging document brought against the alleged killer, Tyler Robinson, just seems weird. Particularly the text exchange between Robinson and his roommate/boyfriend, Lance Twiggs, following the shooting. But with that caveat, here's what we can piece together based on the information available as of this recording. Robinson appears to have arrived on campus earlier that morning and somehow managed to make his way unnoticed to a rooftop about 142 yards from the stage where Kirk was scheduled to speak, carrying a bolt-action Mauser 30-06 long hunting rifle fitted with a scope and hidden somewhere on his person. It was later revealed that his movements on campus were captured by security cameras. Shortly after noon, as Kirk was taking questions, a single shot ran out from the rooftops, striking him in the neck and killing him, but harming no one else. Strangely, there appeared to be no exit wound, which is extremely odd considering the caliber of the rifle. TPUSA spokesperson Andrew Colvett would later call it miraculous, while others contended is further evidence that the official narrative doesn't add up. Upon being shot, blood poured from the wound in Kirk's neck, while the crowd of thousands scrambled to flee the area. Robinson jumped from the rooftop and escaped campus into a nearby neighborhood, still in possession of his weapon and somehow unnoticed. Kirk was taken from the scene and transported to a hospital while the campus was put on lockdown. Within an hour of the shooting, police announced they had a suspect in custody, 71-year-old George Zinn, who was later released after questioning. Zinn is said to have yelled, "I did it," after the shooting. His involvement is yet another bizarre element of the case that has yet to be clearly explained. 2 hours later, Donald Trump announced Kirk's death in a post on Truth Social, writing, "The great and even legendary Charlie Kirk is dead. No one understood or had the heart of the youth in the United States of America better than Charlie. He was loved and admired by all, especially me, and now he is no longer with us. Melania and my sympathies go out to his beautiful wife, Erica, and family. Charlie, we love you." That's my best Trump impression. You'll have to live with it. And later that afternoon, the governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, announced that a second person of interest was in custody, only to be released later. Next morning, FBI announced that they had found the killer's weapons in the woods near campus and released still images of the suspect taken from CCTV videos captured by campus security. Bullet casings in the rifle were engraved with messages reading, "Notices bulges? Ooh, what's this?" An apparent reference to furry culture. "Hey fascist, catch, up, right, down, down, down," suggesting that the shooter believed Kirk to be a fascist, followed by the input command from the video game Helldivers 2 used to call down an airstrike on enemies. "Oh, Bella Chow, Bella Chow, Bella Chow, Chow, Chow." words taken from the Italian song Bella Ciao, historically associated with the anti-fascist movement in Italy. And if you are reading this, you are gay, LMAO. One day later, in an appearance on Fox and Friends, President Trump announced,
I think with a high degree of certainty, we have him.
And later that morning, Governor Cox announced that Tyler Robinson had indeed been taken into custody after being turned in by his father. Although there are still many questions remaining about what happened and some strange aspects of what occurred on September 10th, the charging documents that were released against Tyler Robinson suggest that he was motivated by a left-wing political ideology. It should go without saying that most assassinations of a political figure are committed by adherents to an opposing ideology, but in this case, the charging documents indicate that Robinson's mother informed the authorities that, quote, Robinson had become more political and had started to lean more to the left, becoming more pro-gay and trans rights oriented, end quote. According to a text message exchange released as part of the charging documents between Robinson and Twiggs following the shooting, Robinson explained his motivation, telling his partner, quote, I had enough of his hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out. After Kirk's assassination, the internet erupted with celebration from his political opponents.
Charlie Kirk just got shot.
Well, breaking fucking news, folks. Seems somebody just took a shot at one of the Fanta-Fastest favorite 5-mile-wide mouthpieces, Charles Chucklefuck Kirk.
Although no politicians openly cheered his murder, posts on TikTok and other social media expressing their delight appeared within hours of his death, many of them receiving hundreds and in some cases thousands of likes. In spite of the obvious motivations behind Kirk's assassination, the response from many leftists across the web, including virtually all of my left-leaning friends on Facebook, was to simultaneously applaud the killing while twisting themselves into knots, arguing that Robinson was motivated by some other political ideology than their own. Jimmy Kimmel, in one of the most embarrassing acts of projection I've ever witnessed, told his late-night audience,
We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it.
The statement was made days after the charging document indicating Robinson's leftward political leanings had been publicly released. It wasn't only late-night comedians feigning ignorance regarding Robinson's motivations. MSNBC political analyst Matthew Dowd was fired after suggesting that
we don't know if this was a supporter shooting their gun off in celebration, or so we have no idea about this.
As well as making a backhanded suggestion that Kirk had it coming, saying,
and I always go back to hateful thoughts lead to hateful words, which then lead to hateful actions. And I think that's the environment we're in, that people just, you can't stop with these sort of awful thoughts you have and then saying these awful words and not expect awful actions to take place.
Even Ken Klippenstein, a journalist whose work I've otherwise found to be worthwhile and trustworthy, published a baffling obfuscation of Robinson's politics, based mostly on screenshots from 5-year-old Discord chats about the 2020 election. He also made a verifiably false claim that, quote, the phrase inscribed on one of the bullet casings from the shooting, "Hey fascist, catch," though widely reported to mean he was a man of the left, is in fact a reference to the game Helldivers 2. 3 arrows, initially believed by federal agents to be a reference to Antifa, are also a reference to Helldivers. End quote. Now, while it is true that the arrows are a reference to a command code in Helldivers 2, which I've mentioned before, I also know from personal experience playing the game with my son that the line, "Hey fascist, catch," does not appear anywhere in the game. Nor would it make any sense if it did. Helldivers 2 is a co-op shooter with very little dialogue in which players fight giant space bugs and robots. Many posts on social media made even more convoluted arguments, claiming that Robinson must have been a groyper because they had uncovered pictures of him in the Slav Squat meme pose and pointed to a Spotify playlist called Groyper Wars. The playlist does contain a remix of the song Bella Ciao, but only appeared to have 5 followers and no link to either Robinson or Nick Fuentes at the time of Kirk's shooting. Other arguments reference Robinson's grandmother, Debbie Robinson, who is quoted saying, "My son, his dad is a Republican for Trump," in an interview with the Daily Mail, and she went on to say, "Most of my family members are Republican. I don't know a single one who's a Democrat. I'm just so confused." This odd impulse to have it both ways, on the one hand denying any possibility that the killer could be motivated by leftist ideology they share, while at the same finding it impossible to smother or hide their obvious glee at Kirk's assassination, was the day one response of many leftists to awkwardly deal with their cognitive dissonance following these events. In the days since, more sophisticated approaches have developed. Now, Ned Stark famously said on Game of Thrones, nothing someone says before the word but really counts. As I've said above, no politicians in the Democratic Party or public figures on the left broadly have been foolish enough to openly celebrate the assassination of Charlie Kirk that I'm aware of. But that hasn't stopped them from jumping up to show their supporters just how happily they will draw horns on a straw man effigy of his corpse before burning it publicly. AOC, Ilhan Omar, even former President Obama have made statements in the form of, political violence is always bad, but here's a handful of cherry-picked out-of-context quotes to show you why it's really not so bad, implying that Kirk deserved what he got and that anyone else engaging in wrong things should expect the same. AOC's comments from the floor of the House of Representatives are probably the stupidest example of this phenomenon. She suggests that because Kirk took issue with aspects of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, this meant that he opposed African Americans' right to vote.
We should be clear about who Charlie Kirk was. A man who believed that the Civil Rights Act that granted Black Americans the right to vote was a mistake.
It seems too much to expect that a member of Congress would understand that it was the 15th Amendment that gave African American men the right to vote, the 19th that extended it to women, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act that granted protections from Jim Crow laws in the South that prevented African Americans from exercising their right. But apparently that's just too much to hope for. Furthermore, it is worth noting that Kirk did not oppose the intent of the Civil Rights Act or the end of Jim Crow segregation in the South, rather the unintended downstream consequences resulting from ambiguities in the law, which led to the adoption of more controversial policies like affirmative action and the broadening of Title IX protections for women to include trans women in women's sports and locker rooms. I knew very little about Charlie Kirk prior to his assassination, but I've since reviewed at least a dozen hours of his content. I was aware of his organization TPUSA and had seen enough clips from his famous campus debates to get the South Park episode that made fun of him. I remember watching his debate with Hassan Piker at Politicon in 2018, and more recently, I'd seen him moderate a debate between Josh Hammer and Dave Smith on U.S. support for Israel. Now, I do make a point of following right-wing media in the hopes of better understanding the political divide in our country. But Kirk struck me as a moderate Christian conservative whose views aligned with most Christian conservatives I'd grown up with in Michigan and later gone to college with in Pennsylvania. He never interested me that much until I saw him murdered live on X 3 weeks ago. It was then that I began my search to unravel why Charlie Kirk, of all people, whose views were so ordinary and mundane, why would he be the target of such a brutal and public act of terror? Now, I had scheduled a haircut the afternoon that it happened, and was on my way out the door when I first saw the clip of him bleeding from his neck. So it was the guys at the barber shop who were the first two people I spoke to about the murder. Neither of them even recognized his name when I told them about it, but one was able to make the connection to the South Park episode after I explained a little about who he was. They're both left-leaning Gen X guys, roughly my age, but they seem more interested in old punk bands than politics. I had yet to see any of the reactions online, so this first conversation with them was mostly about how odd it was that a politically motivated assassination had happened in our country. We talked a bit about the assassination of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson by Luigi Mangione, but we also agreed that it wasn't quite the same thing. Thompson was a multimillionaire CEO of a healthcare company, profiting off of denying sick people's claims after they had faithfully paid into the system for years. Well, Charlie Kirk was a podcaster and a debate bro who shared conservative Christian values with college students. The level of vitriol required to murder a man in front of 3,000 people didn't seem to match who he was. It wasn't until I got home and I opened Facebook that I was confronted with the same sort of straw man rationalizations for Kirk's murder that I've described from politicians. Among my friends, there was barely an attempt, and in some cases none at all, to qualify their justifications with any sort of lip service denouncing political violence. I really felt like I was overdosing on crazy pills. I won't recount every post I saw that day, but the sentiments ranged from giddy delight to self-righteous gloating. One friend shared the following post from the group She the People. "You're not a bad person for having empathy for Charlie Kirk. Do I have empathy for him? I shed no tears or waste feelings on a man who has excused grape, called for violence against the LGBTQ community, and also perpetuated white supremacy propaganda. Do I think him being shot will solve anything? Absolutely not. There will be retribution against the people of our country as a result of Trump's ally being shot. The people who will be punished get my empathy, not a piece of shit like him. Like I said, I really didn't know much about Charlie Kirk, but I did know enough about conservative Christians to understand that they weren't typically white supremacist monsters calling for violence and grape. I responded in the comments and shared the post, which I can no longer access now that the group has blocked me. But I wrote, there's very little that I agreed with Charlie Kirk on, but the claim that he excused grape, called for violence against the LGBT community, and perpetuated white supremacist propaganda is unfounded and without evidence. He was a conservative who encouraged debate as an alternative to violence, and even invited those who disagreed with him to the front of the line at his events, something I have yet to see anyone on the left do. It should be an embarrassment to everyone on the left that he was taken down with a bullet rather than with words. There was no Je suis Charlie this time. The response to my post on Facebook, along with other posts I've seen since the assassination, continue with the same pattern of denouncing the straw man construction of Kirk's positions and unsubtly suggesting that he deserved what he got just for thinking them. Most of the lies about Kirk have been debunked elsewhere. Famously, Stephen King apologized for repeating the claim that Kirk was for stoning homosexuals to death, but I'll break down a few that were left in the comments of my Facebook post to illustrate the character assassination that has followed his literal assassination. Okay, here we go. Gay people should be stoned to death. Now, far from endorsing gay people being stoned to death, Kirk defended gay people and encouraged their participation in the conservative movement. The quote in question was taken from Leviticus, and Kirk's reference to it was not an endorsement, but meant to illustrate how people need to be careful when cherry-picking parts of the Bible that are convenient to their argument. Kirk cites the wrong verse as Leviticus 18, which does mention homosexuality, but it's Leviticus 20 that mentions the death penalty. The next one, gun deaths are acceptable in order to have the Second Amendment. Charlie Kirk's exact words in this case were,
"You will never live in a society when you have an armed citizenry and you won't have a single gun death." That is nonsense. It's drivel. But I think it's worth it. I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year, so that we can have the Second Amendment to protect our other God-given rights. That is a prudent deal. It is rational.
Now, this is the same kind of trade-off we make regarding nearly everything we allow into our society, from swimming pools to step ladders, and, as Charlie Kirk points out in the full version of the clip, cars. I don't own a gun or a car myself, and I feel safer for it, but I also don't believe someone had it coming when they're killed by a drunk driver just because they owned a car. All right, this last one was left in the comments on my Facebook post. The wording's a little weird. It read, "Multiple black politicians stole white people's spots." I believe this is referring to the same statement that Washington Post columnist Karen Attia was fired for misquoting on Blue Sky just a few days after Charlie Kirk's death. The original statement was from a 2023 episode of The Charlie Kirk Show, where he says,
"If we would have said 3 weeks ago, Blake, if we would have said that Joy Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee and Ketanji Brown Jackson were affirmative action picks, we would have been called the racist." But now they're coming out and they're saying it for us. They're coming out and they're saying, "I'm only here because of affirmative action." Yeah, we know. You do not have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously. You had to go steal a white person's slot to go be taken somewhat seriously.
I find this one to be the most difficult to defend, and that's why I'm making a point of including it. His choice of words and his attitude are smug and condescending. Now, although he is typically patient and generous during his in-person conversation on campuses, the way he speaks on his podcast is often arrogant and obnoxious. Regardless of his tone, he is speaking about 4 specific black women in extremely powerful positions that few of us will ever hold, who have admitted to benefiting from affirmative action. He is not making a statement about all black women. He believed that these 4 women were unqualified and would not have risen to power without the benefit of affirmative action, which is also kind of the point of affirmative action, to give people a leg up into positions that would not otherwise be accessible to them. To understand Kirk's argument in good faith, it helps if we reframe it in terms of the sort of nepotism that historically has been granted to white people, the sort of in-group preference that affirmative action policies were intended to correct. Imagine if George W. Bush had confessed publicly that he had benefited from his father's wealth and political power, that it opened doors for him that otherwise would have been locked. I expect that very few of us would even pause to disagree, or take issue with a statement like, now he's coming out and he's saying it for us. He's coming out and he's saying, I'm only here because of my daddy. Yeah, we know. You don't have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously. You had to go steal another person's slot to go and be taken somewhat seriously. Of all of his supposedly damning quotes, this is the worst one I've found. And it really comes down to his choice of words in the final sentence. He could have made his point more effectively if he said another person's slot rather than a white person's slot. It stinks of racial grievance, and it undermines any point he might have made about merit. I also understand why he said it. Like it or not, white and Asian men bear the burden of counterbalancing when affirmative action policies are in place. Now, I have mixed feelings about affirmative action and DEI programs. My own parents made a point of sending my brother and me to a racially diverse school that was further from our home, rather than one we could walk to that was 90% white. I personally feel like I benefited from growing up around people with different racial perspectives and experiences. Definitely exposed me to better music, and whatever skills I have on the dance floor started there. As a white person, I gained something, but whether or not affirmative action programs benefit African Americans is still a matter of debate. The orthodoxy of white liberalism teaches us never to question their efficacy, but we may be engaging in the soft bigotry of low expectations. If we listen to Charlie Kirk's arguments, when he's not spouting off like an obnoxious frat boy, it is clear that he didn't come up with these ideas on his own, but is borrowing from prominent conservative black intellectuals like Glenn Loury, John McWhorter, Wilfred Riley, and Thomas Sowell, who all make compelling arguments regarding the downside of affirmative action. In the end, the details of the individual arguments meant to defame Kirk's character aren't all that important. What is critical to understand is how the left will construct a straw man in their echo chambers, completely removed from reality, that appears so villainous that it not only justifies their murder, but gives them license to teabag his corpse once he's dead. It's fucking gross. And I've seen it coming from the top to the bottom over the past 3 weeks. Finally, we need to talk about equivocation and obfuscation. This last approach to both siding the assassination of Charlie Kirk has been trotted out repeatedly across the internet since his death. There are both innocent examples of this phenomenon from otherwise well-meaning liberals, as well as more odious examples that appear to deliberately manipulate the narrative. I believe the former is more common, and many middle-of-the-road lefties and liberals are legitimately struggling with cognitive dissonance. The killing of Charlie Kirk seems to have triggered a "are we the baddies" moment of reflection that has sent them scrambling for evidence that will validate their prior assumptions about political violence being mostly a right-wing problem.
Are we the baddies?
Or at worst, a problem that permeates both sides of the spectrum. Others will argue that this was an isolated incident that doesn't reflect a troubling trend on the left, and there's really no need to consider that there might be an ideological problem that has become fertile soil for violent nihilism. Since Kirk's murder and public celebrations that followed, more conventional Democratic Party types have offered a number of equivocations that appear designed to obfuscate the severity and seriousness of the assassination. Let's take a look at a few of them. First, there's the January 6th riot at the Capitol. I understand that there are many normie Democrats who take this event way more seriously than I do. They view it as an assault on the peaceful transition of power and small d democratic norms. I thought the whole thing was stupid, but I don't believe that anybody entered the Capitol building that day intending to literally murder Mike Pence. Regardless of how serious you believe it was, it doesn't rise to the level of a political assassination. The right to protest the government is enshrined in our Constitution, and even when a protest crosses a line, it is still in another universe from murdering an American whose only crime was holding beliefs Robinson didn't like and debating them with college students. The only person who actually died in the riot that day was Ashley Babbitt, a protester who was shot by the Capitol Police. Although officers and rioters were injured, there doesn't appear to be any evidence that the crowd was motivated by murderous intent. The primary motivation for most of the protesters was to express their displeasure to Congress over a presidential election they believed had been stolen. Maybe it was a ridiculous thing to believe, but there are plenty of reasons to think the 2020 election was unfairly influenced by the media, big tech, and intelligence officials who coordinated to suppress the release of the Hunter Biden laptop. Maybe there's no reason to believe that the adoption of mail-in ballots as a response to the COVID pandemic unfairly favored Joe Biden. But considering how drastically it impacted voter turnout, I'm not surprised it raised eyebrows. Just to be clear, I don't think that votes were fabricated to swing the election. Not because I don't think either party is above cheating if they thought they could get away with it, but because I don't believe it's possible to fake ballots on the scale of millions. The simplest explanation is that everyone was stuck at home with nothing better to do, and millions who otherwise might not have bothered to vote on election day dropped their ballot in a mailbox. However, if I did genuinely believe that a federal election had been stolen, protesting the government would be the appropriate response, which is all January 6th was for the majority of people who showed up. Those who went on to break into the Capitol wandered around and made a mess for a couple hours before ultimately being removed and arrested. In spite of his Stop the Steal rhetoric, Trump left office later that month. Next, let's take a look at this Donald Trump Jr. joke on X about Paul Pelosi, the Paul Pelosi Halloween costume. It's been all over X the past 3 weeks in this doctored form and presented as evidence that conservatives are just as willing to celebrate right-wing violence when it happens to the left. But even this is an inaccurate depiction of what actually happened. The attack on Paul Pelosi was just fucking weird. From the right-wing speculation that the attacker was Paul Pelosi's gay lover and Elon Musk reposting an article claiming the attacker was a gay prostitute Paul Pelosi had picked up, to the actual details of who David Wayne DePape turned out to be, it was all just very strange, and nobody really knows why any of it happened. We do know that DePape was a Canadian living in the United States illegally after his visa had expired. Many Americans were shocked just to learn that there was such thing as a Canadian illegal, but the story only gets weirder from there. We know DePape broke into the Pelosi's home in the middle of the night and hit Paul Pelosi on the head with a hammer before being arrested. In his conversation with the police, he told them that Nancy Pelosi was the intended target of the attack, and he was surprised that she wasn't there. We also know from this conversation that he planned to interrogate her and break her knees if she lied to him. Beyond that, the reasoning behind his motivations is unclear. According to BBC reporting, he had a list of targets he planned to lure to the Pelosi's home, including Gavin Newsom, Gail Rubin, Tom Hanks, and Bill Barr. How he thought they would get there is a mystery. We're told he planned to wear an inflatable unicorn costume during the attack, but apparently he forgot to put it on. He was supposedly radicalized by Gamergate, QAnon, and Jordan Peterson, but somehow was also a leftist and a nudist who regularly used psychedelics and other drugs and lived in a school bus in Berkeley with BLM signs and a rainbow flag, or maybe it was a garage in Richmond with no toilet or a shower. It's confusing, and I'm willing to concede that he probably did have right-wing political motivations of some sort, but the evidence seems to point towards severe mental illness as the determining factor in DePape's attack on Pelosi. There's really little sense to be made of any of it, but when bizarre and incoherent events occur, it is only natural to make jokes about them. It is one way that we deal with events that we can't make sense of. This isn't the same as an endorsement or a celebration. When something absurd happens, it lends itself to humor, even if there is a horrific element to it as well. It is possible to find the oddity of a situation humorous without believing that an old man deserved to get hit in the head with a hammer. I suspect the absurdity of the attack was behind the joke about the Paul Pelosi Halloween costume, but it also wasn't Donald Trump Jr. who made it. The version that has been circulating over the past 3 weeks was photoshopped to make it appear that Donald Trump Jr. came up with the joke all by himself. But the credit for the Paul Pelosi Halloween costume belongs to conservative comedian and podcaster Steve Mudflap, whose post has since been deleted. You can still find the Donald Trump Jr. retweet of Mudflap's post, but he wasn't the originator of the joke. Maybe it doesn't make a difference. In his retweet, Jr. declares, "The internet remains undefeated," which clearly indicates that he thought the joke was funny and worth retweeting. But he then goes on to take shots at Hunter Biden, and the image is found on his infamous laptop, without even mentioning Pelosi. Again, the equivocation between this joke about a bizarre event and the celebration of Charlie Kirk's assassination doesn't really work. There's no widespread applause for DePape's attack on Pelosi or insinuation that he was a bad guy who got what he deserved. He might in fact be a bad guy, but following the attack, most of the discourse on the subject avoided accusations of insider trading and his recent drunk driving arrest. I would be remiss not to mention as well that Charlie Kirk described the attack as awful, but also suggested,
by the way, if some amazing patriot out there in San Francisco or the Bay Area wants to really be a midterm hero, someone should go and bail this guy out. I bet his bail's like $30,000 or $40,000. Bail him out and then go ask him some questions.
This comment from Kirk has also been cited as evidence of his villainy over the past 3 weeks.
Who, after the violent attack on Paul Pelosi, claimed that, quote, some amazing patriot, unquote, should bail out his brutal assailant.
But usually without the complete quote, making it clear that Kirk's interest was in asking DePape questions about his motives. Instead, it has been presented in some form of, when Paul Pelosi was attacked, Charlie Kirk said, someone should go and bail this guy out, making it appear that Kirk was simply advocating turning DePape loose. And when it comes to Donald Trump Jr. retweeting a joke about the Paul Pelosi Halloween costume, most of us can probably agree it makes him something of an asshole. I suspect most of us probably realize that about him already, but being an asshole is not the same as taking murderous delight in the assassination of a political enemy. There are critical differences between the two events, and the most significant being that although Paul Pelosi was injured badly, he's still alive. The case of James Alex Field Jr.'s murder of Heather Heyer in the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, is a much clearer case of right-wing violence comparable to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. But in spite of that, I haven't seen it raised that often in online whataboutism. It's been 8 years since right-wing groups gathered to march on Charlottesville with tiki torches and polo shirts, but there hasn't really been anything like it since. It is estimated that roughly 500 people gathered to protest the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee, where they clashed with counter-protesters who numbered somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500. The events that occurred at this rally are widely known to most Americans, but the relevant piece is that James Alex Fields Jr. drove his Dodge Challenger through a crowd of counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring 35 others. Fields was a 20-year-old from Ohio with a troubled family background and a laundry list of mental disorders, including bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. He was known for drawing swastikas on his high school notebooks and spoke openly about his love for Adolf Hitler. There is no debate about his motivations or his ideology. Much has been made about then-President Donald Trump's very fine people on both sides comments.
Very fine people on both sides.
But condemnation of this equivocation requires overlooking the complete quote, which includes his insistence.
And I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally.
The second part of Trump's statement has been so often ignored by the media and his political opponents that it's come to be known as the very fine people hoax by many Americans. The truth is, Heyer's murder received no praise from mainstream conservatives. Outside of neo-Nazi and white supremacist message boards, such as Stormfront, the response from both the left and the right was horror and disgust. Steve Bannon, in an interview with the American Prospect following the rally, told them, "Ethno-nationalism, it's for losers. It's a fringe element. I think the media plays it up too much, and we gotta help crush it. Crush it more. These guys are a collective of clowns." Even Jason Kessler, the organizer of the event, told the press, "I disavow any political violence, and what happened yesterday was tragic." David Duke, Richard Spencer, and the white nationalist publication The Daily Stormer all praised Donald Trump following the rally, but even they wouldn't go so far as to openly support the violence or the killing of Heyer. Now, last of all here, we have a case of cooking the numbers, and I think this is a little bit more nefarious than some of the other comparisons that we've looked at. It is really the most transparently deceitful example of equivocation and obfuscation following the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And this came in The Economist magazine when they published an article titled, "Is Radical Left Violence Really on the Rise in America?" They promoted this on X with a graph comparing criminal cases involving political violence by ideology. And this data has been taken from an open source research platform called the Prosecution Project, or TPP for short. And it suggests that political violence in the United States has been on the decline, but is still overwhelmingly driven by the right. I've seen this one shared repeatedly both on X and by people I know personally. This soothing balm for liberals confronting "Are we the baddies?"
The badges on our caps. Have you looked at them?
What? No. A bit.
They've got skulls on them.
Might be a comforting reassurance to their self-righteous moral superiority, but unfortunately, the data doesn't hold up even under the mildest of scrutiny. The entire dataset is available on their website, and upon examination, it becomes obvious that something tricky was done to the data in order to arrive at these numbers. When you give the data a closer look, it appears that the definition of left-wing crime is excruciatingly narrow, while the definition of right-wing crime is overwhelmingly broad. It's a lot to go through, but at a high level, TPP massaged the data to exclude violence done during the BLM riots, which reached nearly 600 just in the first 90 days following George Floyd's death. And then it includes prison violence committed by the Aryan Brotherhood, also a white nationalist who murdered his ex-wife over a custody dispute, and it also counts killing by black nationalists as right-wing. According to TPP's data classification, any anti-government violence appears to be coded right-wing, including Antifa setting fire to a courthouse, or BLM rioters vandalizing a federal building, and the sabotage that's been done by eco-terrorists. Here's one specific example. 2 of 5 men accused of the beating death of a mentally retarded man went on trial in what is being called a racially motivated killing. Altogether, 5 African-American men, ages 17 to 22, have been charged with beating and stomping Gregory Griffith, 50, to death in the August incident. The group allegedly had planned to attack the first white man who walked down the street. A witness testified that he saw fists flying and a white man backing out of a crowd, swinging and ducking before falling to the ground and being kicked in the midriff and the head. Griffith died 13 days later from blunt head trauma. Now, according to TPP coding, this attack is counted as rightist, identity-focused. Although the distortions by TPP make it difficult to discern exactly where we stand when it comes to politically motivated crime, recent YouGov polling following Kirk's murder make it clear how attitudes towards political violence have changed based on political affiliation. YouGov says, overall, most Americans say violence to achieve political goals is never justified. That's 72%. Well, just 11 say it can be. However, younger and more liberal Americans are more likely than older, more conservative Americans to say political violence can sometimes be justified. But this remains a minority opinion among these groups. Among the very liberal, 25% say that political violence can sometimes be justified, and 55% say that it can't. Among adults under 30, 19% say it can be justified, and 51% say it can't. Liberals should take no comfort in the delusion that their political house is clean, or that right-wing violence is a greater threat to peace in our country. Right-wing violence, when it happens, is rarely tolerated, let alone celebrated by mainstream conservatives. It is time to accept that you are the baddies.
Okay. So...
Now, I've been speaking mostly about the left so far, but we should also talk about reactions from the right. As of this recording, 3 weeks out from Charlie Kirk's assassination, there's been no violent retaliation from the right directed at the left in this country. There have been no riots, no one has fired shots at Rachel Maddow or Hassan Piker, no one has toppled statues of MLK or set fire to university buildings. Conservatives have mostly responded to Kirk's murder by going to church and praying. That being said, I'm not here to paint a rosy picture of the right, particularly those in President Trump's administration who aren't about to let a crisis go to waste. As was the case in France following the attack on Charlie Hebdo, the Trump administration has wasted no time in turning a violent terrorist attack on free speech into rationale for state suppression of free speech. Following the assassination, Attorney General Pam Bondi appeared on Katie Miller's podcast to say,
free speech, and then there's hate speech. And there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie, in our society. We will absolutely target you, go after you, if you are targeting anyone with hate speech, anything.
This is an ironic position to take, considering what Kirk had to say about hate speech. And I quote, "Hate speech does not exist legally in America. There's ugly speech, there's gross speech, there's evil speech, and all of it is protected by the First Amendment. Keep America free." Ultimately, Bondi had to walk back her comments with the qualification, hate speech that crosses the line into threats of violence is not protected by the First Amendment. I've only ever seen clips of Jimmy Kimmel Live, and I've never been masochistic enough to force myself to endure sitting through an entire episode of his program. I don't particularly care one way or the other if ABC decides to take him off the air. They certainly have every reason to, considering he deliberately misled his audience about Robinson's political motivations. However, I see no justification for FCC Chairman Brendan Carr putting his finger on the scale or starting to threaten affiliate station broadcast licenses. Among the chattering class of pundits and podcasters on the right, it's been 3 weeks of bickering over which one of them was BFFs with Kirk and the rightful heir to his mantle. These disputes all seem to revolve around the question of Kirk's feelings about Israel and whether or not his long-standing support was eroding. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spared no hesitation in awkwardly assuring the world on X that Charlie Kirk was murdered for speaking the truth and defending freedom. A lion-hearted friend of Israel, he fought the lies and stood tall for Judeo-Christian civilization. Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens have both made comments suggesting Kirk's position was evolving on the subject of Israel-Palestine, while Ben Shapiro and Mark Levin both insist his support remained steadfast until the very end. Rank-and-file conservatives have also been quick to drop their opposition to cancel culture now that the shoe is on the other foot, with many rallying to get anyone celebrating Kirk's assassination fired from their job or deplatformed from social media. The best and worst conservative reactions to Kirk's murder both came from his memorial service. Erica Kirk, Charlie's widow, lived up to her Christian values when she spoke of his killer, saying,
"On the cross, our Savior said, 'Father, forgive them, for they not know what they do.'" That man, that young man, I forgive him.
Donald Trump, on the other hand, couldn't help but spoil the moment by being Trump when he spoke about Kirk.
His opponents, he wanted the best for them. That's where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry. I am sorry, Erica.
What is notable above all about the conservative responses to Kirk's assassination is the lack of calls for violent retaliation directed at the left. Many have expressed that they hope Robinson receives the death penalty, but I've yet to see any suggestion that it's time for street justice. So after all of that, here's my final thoughts on the matter. The 2015 attack on Charlie Hebdo was an assault on free speech. Terrorists didn't like what the writers and editors of the magazine had to say, and they attempted to put a stop to it in the most violent and horrific way imaginable, and send a clear and chilling message to France and the rest of the world. If you say the wrong thing, express the wrong opinion, or make the wrong joke, we will kill you. If you step one toe out of line with our ideology, you will be next. The attack on Charlie Kirk was no different in its intent. Assassination is the ultimate form of censorship. But 10 years later, the response was much different. There's no unity, no Je suis Charlie this time, and I'm left wondering what has changed. I have ideas about how to answer this question, and I hope to return to this subject in the future. But for the moment, I believe much can be learned from the engraving on Robinson's bullet, "Hey Fascist, Catch," and understanding the Antifa ideology that it refers to. Following the assassination of Charlie Kirk, a meme has been spreading on the right that takes some form of, they don't kill you because you're a fascist, they call you a fascist so that they can kill you. Some versions use Nazi instead of fascist, but it could really be any of the left-wing buzzwords used to demonize their opponents and silence any debate or discussion. Racist, misogynist, transphobe, any number of these could work. The irony is that few, if any, of these so-called anti-fascists seem to understand what fascism actually is. Now it's just become a label for people that they want to murder. Fascism, as a political theory, is the apotheosis of the state. Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy, the birthplace of fascism, described it in writing, "Everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state." The problem is that this form of government is definitionally antithetical to American conservatism, which seeks to shrink the size and influence of government, but a convenient label if you want to murder your political opponents. Jeffrey Mead breaks this down in his article on Substack, when political rhetoric turns into permission for violence.
This isn't random. Charlie Kirk's assassination and the celebration of it fits into a historical playbook that has repeated over and over again. When you understand the mechanics, it becomes obvious where America's heading if this isn't confronted. Step 1. Define the opponent as evil. Every time Democrats call conservatives fascist, Nazis, or threats to democracy, they aren't just debating. They're branding conservatives as illegitimate outside the boundaries of normal political competition. Here are some historical echoes, right? In the 1930s, Germany called the Jews parasites and rats. 1990s in Rwanda, Tutsis branded cockroaches. 1960s America, civil rights activists dismissed as agitators and communists. Once someone is defined as evil, violence stops being seen as violence. It then becomes defense. Step 2, signal that normal rules don't apply. If conservatives are Nazis, then punching them isn't assault, it's resistance. If Charlie Kirk is a fascist, then shooting him isn't terrorism, it's liberation. This is how permission structures form, not through direct calls for violence, but by shifting the moral framework so opponents no longer qualify for the same protections. Step 3, justify, minimize, or celebrate the violence. And this is exactly what we've seen after Charlie Kirk's murder. Online voices mocking him, media pundits saying, we don't know if the shots were fired, maybe in celebration, ignoring common sense realities. And celebration is the final stage. Once violence is normalized, more people begin to see it as acceptable, even desirable.
Most people who hated Charlie Kirk and celebrated his murder don't even have a clear understanding of who the man was. Their image of him is based on political lunch table gossip scrawled in a burn book straight out of the movie Mean Girls. They know he's a fascist, and a racist, and a Nazi, and that's all they need to know to hate him. Once he's been labeled, there's nothing more to learn. The problem is that Charlie Kirk was not a fascist or a Nazi. He was a Christian first and foremost. That was his ideology, and it's an ideology he shared with 62% of Americans and 2.3 billion people across the world. It is the same ideology that led my grandparents to risk their lives resisting the occupation by actual Nazis in the Netherlands. The beliefs my grandparents held that led them to hide Jews, forge papers for them, and guide them onto boats across the English Channel were nearly identical to those held by Charlie Kirk. But if they were alive today, many on the left would call them Nazis just for thinking these thoughts. I've talked a lot about left and right here, and I'm not sure if these are even meaningful markers anymore. I did write about it on my Substack. You can go there and look for the article on Luigi Mangione, where I get into the details. But I mention it again because I'm not sure where I stand anymore. I do still support leftist economic policies, but I don't really trust leftists to govern anymore. I still believe it should be a national embarrassment that we spend 19% of GDP on healthcare, while Canada, England, and Japan spend only 11%, while managing to cover everyone and achieve better outcomes. I believe that college should be free or close to it, the minimum wage should be $20 an hour, there should be no cap on social security tax, and the tax on capital gains should be at least 20 points higher. I think we should be welcoming to immigrants into our country, but creating a permanent underclass of undocumented workers with no political rights isn't kindness, it's just a libertarian wet dream. For up to me, the top marginal tax rate would return to post-war pre-Reagan levels, not because I think the government should have more money, but because I believe it creates an incentive structure that encourages businesses to reinvest and pay their workers higher wages. When it comes down to it, I'm still basically a 2015 Bernie bro. I say all of this because what I've seen from the self-described left these past 5 years has been censorship, bullying, and lies concocted to push policies that help almost no one and that 80% of Americans don't want. And look, if you've made it this far and you're a self-described leftist thinking, this doesn't apply to me, okay, good. Doesn't apply to you. You're the exception. But I'm sure you know plenty of rage-filled lunatics more interested in punching TERFs and setting Teslas on fire than working to improve the lives of average people. They're bloodthirsty psychopaths who will celebrate your death if you deviate one iota from their bullshit orthodoxy. 6 years ago, I spent much of my free time doing what Charlie Kirk did. Not on college campuses trying to convince people to get married and have kids, but on the streets and neighborhoods of Oakland, talking to people about Bernie Sanders' vision for America and how policies like Medicare for All could improve their lives. In the end, Bernie didn't win the nomination, but he did win the state of California, and that could not have happened if people like me weren't allowed to speak freely about our beliefs. Democracy cannot work without freedom of speech. And I won't be so cliche as to misquote Voltaire here, but I will say emphatically, Je suis, Charlie. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This is the first video I've done like this, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch. And please leave a comment, a like, share it with a friend, subscribe. I hope to do more. If you have any suggestions, please feel free to get in touch with me. Probably Twitter's the best way to do it, or X, at Diablo Neruda, or leave a comment here. Maybe I'll try to get in touch with you. But this was something that I felt like I needed to do. I was genuinely shocked by not just the killing of Charlie Kirk, but the way that people that I knew were responding to it. Not just randos out there on TikTok that I'd never met before. So in the weeks since, I do think that the level of conflict is not dissipated. It's only increased in this country, and I really hope we can come together and find some resolution to it and try to see each other more as humans who are just trying to figure our lives out and how to best live on this earth and in this country. So, thanks again. Bye.